did you learn about the breath when you were in your time in the ashram?
Yeah, so if you don't mind, I can share the story that I share in the book. And so I remember the pretty much my first day of monk school, and I've shaved my hair. I'm wearing robes for the first time, and I still look like I'm from London and don't fit in, and I'm trying to figure my way around. And I see a very young monk, probably like 10, 11 years old, and he's teaching a group of younger monks who are probably like, very young, very young. And he's teaching them something. So I'm observing and I'm watching them. And then he comes out of the class and I'm just, first of all, I'm just perplexed that a 10 or 11-year-old's teaching anything. And then after that, I'm just like, well, what was going on there? And he was like, oh yeah, that was their first class. And I was like, their first class of what? And he was like, well, that's their first class of school. And I was like, oh, cool. What did you teach them? And he was like, well, what did you learn at your first class of school? And I was like, I think I learned how to count or the ABCs. And he said, well, yeah, well, for them, do you want to know what I taught them? And I was like, yeah, sure. And he was like, well, I was teaching them how to breathe. And I was like, what do you mean teaching them how to breathe? Like everyone knows how to breathe. You just breathe, right? And he said, no, he said, from the moment we're born to the moment we're dead, the only thing that stays with us is our breath. He said that we change countries, we change jobs, we change careers, we change passions, but he goes, our breath is always with us. And he said that our breath is the root of every emotion we experience. When we're happy, what changes? Our breath. When we're sad, what changes our breath? When we're struggling or disappointed or we're nervous or anxious, what changes our breath? And he said that if we learn to navigate our breath, then we'll learn to navigate life. And I was just blown away. And now when I look back, I've even thought about that. And I think, we always say things like, I'm trying to catch my breath, or let me just take a
Mm,
breath. Or even in positive things, we say, he or she takes my breath away,
mm.
or that view is breathtaking. So every emotion in our life is centered around breath. And breath makes the mind and the emotions tangible because we can feel our breath. And so what I learned was that every experience I had, whether it was anxiety, nerves, uh, sadness, disappointment, I could feel it in my breath. And that if I could change the way I breathe, I could change the way I experience something. Now, that's not about getting away from the feeling. It's about being able to process and heal the feeling properly.
What kind of breath work do you do?
Yeah, so we were introduced to many different forms of breath work. A lot of it was from the tradition of pranayama,
Mm,
which I'm sure you may have practiced as well in
yes.
some of your immersive experiences. Everything from breath work like Kapalabhati breath through to Anulom Vilom. If you're aware of these terms, then you know the different types of breath. You may see people playing around with their thumbs and their
Mm,
fingers on their nose. But the simpler forms of breath work that I learned that have been really powerful for me, and a lot of these are spoken about today and used in psychology and therapy, but we were introduced to them as monks. And so whether you're breathing in for a count of 4 and breathing out for more than 4, that's been one that I probably use the most. And so if I'm feeling nervous when I'm coming on an interview or about to go on stage, or if I'm doing something that I'm feeling anxious about, or if I can't get to sleep at night, then I'll breathe in for a count of 4 and I'll count in my mind 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll breathe out for more than 4. And every time I do it, it works amazingly because every time I'm about to go on stage or in front of thousands of people, naturally my heart starts to beat really fast. I start to sweat a little bit. You get a bit nervous. And every time I do that breath work, it just makes me feel aligned again. And that's how we were introduced to breath work, is that most of us experience one of two things. When we wake up in the morning, either our mind is ahead of our body. Have you ever had that where your mind is just racing around
yes.
and your body's like, ugh, I just want to be in bed? Or you experience the opposite. You wake up and your body's running around and needs to do a lot. And your mind goes, oh, let me still be in bed. And so our mind and our body are always out of sync. So when we breathe in for the same amount of time as we breathe out, we realign our mind and body. And so anytime you feel like your mind or your body are out of sync or they're causing some friction, breathe in for the same amount of time as you breathe out, and you'll start to see
Mm.
some alignment.
It's unbelievable how powerful the breath is. And it's something that, I love that story that you told in Think Like a Monk. When I heard it, I was like, wow, that is so unbelievably powerful. When I started practicing breath work, and I do a lot of the Kundalini breathing, which is quite full on, and it's the shifting of energy. So, kind of to move that stagnant energy up into the brain. I just realized that how unbelievably transformational it is. So it's, definitely something that I highly recommend. Let's talk about the mind, because that is something that we all have, and it's a huge part of your book, Think Like a Monk, and something that you learned a lot about when you were studying as a monk. Let's talk about mindfulness, because that's obviously the biggest buzzword and it has been for a very long time. But before that, I just want to read a passage out of your book that I thought was so unbelievably pertinent and a very sweet story. A senior monk once told me an old story about these dilemmas which all of us agonize over. An elder tells his grandson every choice in life is a battle between two wolves inside of us. One represents anger, envy, greed, fear, lies, insecurity, and ego. The other represents peace, love, compassion, kindness, humility, and positivity. They are competing for supremacy. Which wolf wins? The grandson asked. The one you feed, the elder replies. I just love that story. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you learnt about the mind?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite refreshing insights about the mind that I learned through the Bhagavad Gita and the other texts that I studied as a monk is that they talk about the interaction between three things. So it's the senses, the mind, and then the intelligence, which acts in the middle. So our senses are wired to appreciate, admire, and be attracted to certain things. So if you were someone like me who was fed 4 chocolate products a day growing up, I have a great affinity towards chocolate, and I'm plant-based. I have a plant-based lifestyle. So I'm talking about, dairy-free chocolate. And so I get really into chocolate. But the point I'm making is that our senses get attracted to something. And then our senses go and ask the mind, what do you reckon? Do you think that's all right? And the mind looks at its previous experiences and goes, yeah, last time we had chocolate, it was great. Because the mind is tapping into that immediate instant gratification. And so the mind goes back to the senses and goes, go for it. Go and eat that chocolate or whatever it may be for you. And that sometimes can become addictive. It can become obsessive. It can lead us the wrong way. We all know what our own vices are. And so whether that's a food you're trying to give up, or whether it's alcohol you're trying to give up, or whatever it may be that you're trying to give, or you're trying to get up early and you wake up in the morning and your senses go, let's go back to sleep. Check in with the mind. The mind goes, yeah, might as well go back to sleep. And then you go to sleep. And so we're used to hearing or feeding the voice of the mind. We're used to feeding that laziness, the complacency, the lethargy. We're used to also feeding the negativity. When we hear gossip, sometimes our ears perk up and want to know more. When we hear something negative about someone, it's almost more interesting than if you heard something positive about that person. And you just almost you're listening even more attentively. And we see this in our conversations all the time. So all of those activities and habits are feeding the bad dog or the bad wolf in that analogy that I was told. Now, the intelligence is almost like the gatekeeper or the guard that stops the senses and the mind from easily communicating and just running riot and taking you where they want. So the intelligence is only as strong as you've created discipline and courage in your life to follow the higher values and the higher qualities.